So welcome to the second afternoon panel of today's sessions of the seminar. So this is on the heart and the will, different aspects of the will and affectivity, and Seifert's critique of Hildebrand, which we heard a little bit of yesterday, but we will hear the full thing today, I believe. So we have Mark Spencer and Josef Seifert, both of whom we've met already. I need no further introduction. Who will be going first?
Joseph.
Joseph will be going first.
And I'm
okay.
Responding to him.
Oh, great. Oh well, this is going to be very interesting. I look forward to this. Okay. Well, Joseph will start, and then Mark. As we have been doing, go ahead and submit your questions in the Q&A along the way, and we'll call on people at the end to ask questions. So welcome to everyone who's viewing live on Facebook. And with that, I turn it over to you, Joseph.
Thank you very much. Well, the question of the heart and the will in Hildebrand's philosophy has many aspects. The first thing that I wanted to stress after Father's presentation is that I think that the distinction between the heart and the will is a very marked distinction. Of course, we cannot group all the feelings we have under one center, the heart, because we have also sensible bodily feelings like hunger and thirst and pain and headaches, and these are not from the same center from which the spiritual affective experiences come. Therefore, if we want to add to the spiritual or to the spiritual powers or centers of the intellect and of the will, the heart as a third one, then we have in mind a more specific sense of heart, not the heart, not the center of feeling pain in the finger, but the center of spiritual forms of affectivity. And these spiritual forms of affectivity have, I believe, an essence, a nature that is markedly distinct from the will. Therefore, to have grouped them for many millennia under the will, I think, is a mistake that Hildebrand shows in his book on the heart and in other writings. He points out three or more, but I will just mention three very fundamental distinctions between the will and the heart. First, the heart, the movements of the heart and the spiritual affections are not within our direct power. We cannot simply command to feel something. The will, however, is under our direct power. We can decide, we can take decisions, we can act, prevent us from using the will. Secondly, the will has a I could say, a more linear, a more one and the same essence, whatever we will. So to speak, the will remains the will, and we don't have other words for it. But the heart has an incredible number of different shades, of different kinds of affections, for which we have many different names, like despair and hope and desire and joy and exuberant joy and enthusiasm and love and so comparable to a river, the will, and compared to an ocean, the world of affections. And so maybe these two elements are enough for the moment. These are very important distinctions, because if the heart is not under our direct control, then it is obviously different from the will. Society has that as its essential mark, that we are the master over our free acts. As Aristotle says, we are the master over the Lord, over the being or non-being of our own free acts. And that is not true at all about our affections. Now, Hildebrand did not just make the distinction very clearly between the two. Maybe the third and possibly even the most elementary distinction is that simply it's evident that feeling joy and willing something is different. There are two forms of experience, two forms of acts that are simply different. And there's many emotions or feelings or affective experiences which would be absurd to say we just will them, like happiness, the highest goal in Aristotle's ethics. Happiness, if it's not felt, it is no happiness. Or joy, if not felt, it's not happiness. You just willed joy, that is no joy. So if we start with this clear distinction between the heart as the center of spiritual affections and the intellect and the will, which are also among themselves quite different, then this does not mean that they are separate entities in the human person, or that there are no clear manifold connections between them. And Hildebrand in his ethics has, from chapter 20 to 25, he has developed many fundamentally different and important relations between the will and the heart. The first one is what he calls indirect freedom. In other words, through our free acts and free actions, we predispose ourselves to having certain affections. For example, if we, with our will, are hateful, resentful, mean persons, then we will have terrible emotions like rejoicing in the damage and the harm of other persons, or enjoying the sadistic torture of them. And this, of course, while it's not within our direct power, still has roots in our will, and it depends on the way of life we lead, on our virtues or vices, which kinds of affection will arise in our soul. And then Hildebrand makes another contribution, very important one that has already been mentioned by Mark and others, Maria. He introduces this notion of cooperative freedom. And this cooperative freedom is, so to speak, our call to use our freedom in cooperation with our affective responses. So if we feel a deep joy over the liberation of a prisoner or the conversion of a great sinner, then we cannot simply say, yeah, we feel that joy and so nothing, but rather our will is called to join the voice of our will, of our consent, of our approval, of our sanction to the voice of the heart, so that there's some kind of wedding between the free will and the affective response. And one might even see in that capacity of the will to cooperate with good affections a certain climax of the role of the free will. Because if we think for a moment religiously, we can say the highest form of using the free will in man or in any creature is to cooperate with divine grace. That is precisely the central teaching of the Catholic Church regarding grace and free will, that we are not simply saved by grace over our heads, that we are not simply asked to receive grace and do nothing. No, we are called to cooperate, to join in with our free will this gift of grace. And so in an analogous way, a purely human way, we can say that positive emotions, which are not within our direct power, which are somehow like graces or like gifts, we are called to cooperate. And how so? Well, because these emotions are clearly based on the cognition of certain values, of certain truths, of certain realities. And therefore, our affective response is quite meaningfully and well and in a good way related to these objects. And so if we see that with our intellect, then of course with our will, we should fully approve, we should fully incorporate, we should fully make our own these affective responses and not leave them to a kind of chance that they might go and come and so. No, we should, with our will, deeply form them and integrate them in our free center. So these are two very important contributions on the distinction between heart and will, on the relations between heart and will that Hildebrand makes, where he distinguishes this indirect freedom and then the quite different corporative freedom. However, Hildebrand says in his chapter 17 in his Ethics, and also in chapter 2 of his of his Nature of Love book, he says that love is an effective response, and the reason he gives is not simply the experience that we feel love, but the reason he gives is the following. He says that the will can only respond to states of affairs, and of course love cannot love a state of affair. We love a person, or perhaps a dog, or we love God, but we don't love a state of affairs. That A is B, or that A is not B. That's what a state of affairs is, that we don't love. So the will, the response of the will could not be love, because if the will were only directed to states of affairs and not to persons, then love could never be an act of the will. Secondly, he says that the volitional response can only respond to not yet real states of affairs, but not like hope, also not yet real states of affairs that are not within our power, but only to not yet real states of affairs which are within our power to realize. So the will, the free will, would act in the, and it's, I think, very true, can only act in the form of the action will with regard to states of affairs that are not yet realized and that can be realized to us. Now, one could of course ask whether that's quite correct, because Hildebrand distinguishes the first perfection of the will, the response, the inner yes or no to some object, to some good, to some value, to God, and the second perfection of the will, where the will is the king of the action and can command activities that lead to the realization of the not yet realized states of affairs. And of course, the will in these two senses cannot be love. In fact, if the volitional response were indeed restricted to unrealized states of affairs that are realizable to us, then the role of the will within the person would be very much inferior to the role of the heart, because the affective response can respond to persons, can respond to God, not just to state of affairs, and to state of affairs which are not yet realized. And so, since Hildebrand gives in an important chapter in his book, The Nature of Love, this reason, among others, why love is an effective response, he, I think, makes a claim that it can be shown to be false. And he himself, Hildebrand himself, corrected this in many dialogues with me after I published a book in which I criticized this position. And he corrected it in his posthumous work, Moralia. He says that this has not been a correct statement. Now, I think Hildebrand himself, in his whole philosophy and ethics, has corrected implicitly this thesis, because he, in already the corporative freedom, is a kind of free yes to the beloved person and a free yes to our love, not to a state of affairs that are not realized. Or, for example, in his teaching of the super-actual free will, like in Virtues, for example, he distinguishes the action, the concrete action, or the concrete response, and he distinguishes them from what he calls super-actual, long-lasting acts, that without which we cannot understand the person. If every act of the person were just in a second, in a particular moment, and then would be cease to exist, the person would be completely misunderstood. And so Hildebrand has a great contribution on the philosophy of virtue, that the virtues are super-actual free responses to whole spheres of values, like justice, like truth, and so on. So in these teachings on virtues, and also in the teaching of cooperative freedom itself, Hildebrand really shows that the will is not restricted just to the second dimension where he realized where we realize through our will unrealized states of affairs that are realizable through us. And also, of course, in the act of hope, that refers to states of affairs that are not yet realized, but that are not realizable to us. We still have a free act of opting for the object of hope. And one of our best students, Paola Premoli de Marchi, in the Academy in Liechtenstein, has written a marvelous book, Ethics of Assent, in which she develops very much further Cardinal Newman's insights in the grammar of assent, distinction between notional and real assent, in which she shows that also in the intellectual act of assenting to a truth, there is an element of free will. And she shows very brilliantly many relationships between the intellect and the life of the intellect and free will. We can say that is also like opening ourselves for the truth, opening ourselves for knowledge, taking an attitude of reverence towards being that allows us to search the truth, and so on. So I think that the will is very much related to the sphere of the intellect and to truth, and of course also to the affective life, as Hildebrand himself shows. Now, I think that is not quite enough, because the role of the will indirectly and in cooperative freedom of the heart, I think, does not exhaust the scope of the will. I think one has to, in a certain way, entirely leave this thesis that the volitional response can only refer to non-realized states of affairs realizable to me. And one has to recognize, as Father Brent said in his lecture, that the will can refer to all kinds of goods and can say an inner yes to them. If we think, for example, of the supreme act of free will of Our Lady, Ecce Ancilla Domini, behold the handmaid of the Lord, be it done unto me according to thy will, that is not referring to, well, it's referring to an unrealized state of affairs, but not at all one that is within her power. So this free consent, this free assent and acceptance of something done to me, for example, is also an action of the will that is not at all corresponding to this more narrow definition of Hildebrand of the free will in his ethics. And so I think we can say also that within if we see the value of a person, the intrinsic preciousness of a person as a whole, then it seems also quite illogical to say that we can say a yes to the person only with our affective response and not with our will. Why should we not, with our free will, also affirm this goodness of the other person, this value of the other person, and also commit ourselves to love the other person? So I think this is an important point. Also, if we consider what Josef Pieper declared to be the most fundamental word of love, he somehow defines love by that love, the loving person speaks to the beloved person, how good that you exist, how good that you are. And that word is certainly a word of our free will. We can, with our free will, affirm that, and also with our intellect. And of course, in our heart, we can rejoice and love the other person, and thereby also, in a certain way, have an effective outcry, how good that you exist. But nevertheless, it's in no way logical that there's not also an act of loving the other person that is with the will. Also, if we consider the different intentions that Hildebrand distinguishes, the intentio unionis and the intentio benevolentia, the benevolent intention, for example, that is of the essence of love, then this benevolent intention to promote or to help or to realize or to contribute to the happiness and to all well-being of the beloved person, that is an act of love that is certainly more an act of the will than just of the heart. Although there's of course the benevolence that is felt in the heart. And I do think that Hildebrand has quite marvelously recognized that the heart has a role in its distinctness from the will and from the intellect. The heart has a role in the spiritual life of the person that is absolutely irreplaceable by just the will or the intellect. But also the voice of the will is irreplaceable by the heart. So each of these three fundamental centers or three fundamental faculties or powers, the will, the intellect, and the heart, have an absolutely irreducible and indispensable role in order to do justice to the whole human person and to subsume the heart only as if it were just a side point, an accident of the will, is, I think, in no way doing justice to the depths of this source of spiritual act. And if we are Christians and believe that we have been redeemed through the passion and death of our Lord, then certainly the affective response, the tears of Jesus over Jerusalem, the suffering over the sins on the Mount Olive, the desire for the salvation of the soul, which moved him to descend from the throne of the Holy Trinity to earth to become man and to undergo the most cruel and most horrible sufferings. I think, how can we say that this is only an act of the will and there's no heart, there's no feeling? No, of course there is. And then finally, I want to say that in my opinion, the claim that God has no feelings and God is only will and intellect and the emotions and the affective center is only something of the human person, or perhaps not also of the angels, is, I think, another big error. Because I think that the value of the heart is such that there's no person who can be perfect without it. And if God experiences the supreme blessedness, the supreme happiness, then of course he must feel this happiness also. And therefore, to reduce the divine perfections only to intellect and will is also, in a certain way, depriving God of his personhood. And therefore, I think that the personalism of Hildebrand obliges us to recognize to the fullest extent these three centers, or we call them faculties or powers, that's not so important, but these three, so to speak, fundamental characteristics and powers of the person to understand, to use the intellect for many operations, to use the free will, and to feel in the heart, especially the spiritual value responses and feelings. These are all fundamental features of the person. With this, I conclude modestly, not adding another hour to my.
Oh, actually, that was remarkably within time, Joseph. I'm very impressed.
Nobody knows me expects that from me.
Well, thank you for that. We have some, I think, really interesting questions coming in, but we'll turn it to Mark first for his reply, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So, Mark, you ready?
Thanks, Christopher,
All right.
and thank you, Joseph. So I want to make some remarks about the things that Joseph just said. I don't want to challenge directly any of the substantial claims, I don't think. I mean, I think that this threefold distinction of intellect, heart, and will is enormously fruitful and helpful for understanding ourselves, for understanding the spiritual life, for understanding God's life, and so forth in all the ways that Joseph laid out. As I was listening to Joseph's talk and also reading over his paper, which he published on this topic a few years ago, I was reflecting though about how do we go about assessing these sorts of claims about the person? How do we go about assessing these sorts of claims about the powers of the person and the way in which we carve up our interior life? Because that seems to me a significant philosophical question that's being asked here. And here are just a few sort of scattered thoughts that I have along these topics. First of all, I think that it's important to keep in mind that a lot rides on the meanings of the terms that we're using here. So let me just run through a few examples. We have this debate about what belongs to the will. Thomas Aquinas, as we've heard from Beth Rath and from Father Brent, attributes all sorts of stuff to the will. So the will includes, or the will is the power whereby we make choices, whereby we intend an end, whereby we love, whereby we have all sorts of spiritual affections, whereby ultimately we have joy in union with God. Hildebrand, by contrast, makes a more fine-grained distinction, we might say, and he attributes far less to the will. The will engages in acts of indirect freedom, of cooperative freedom, and of making choices or commanding such that we respond to and at least attempt to realize a state of affairs that has not yet been realized. And of course, as Joseph said, then all this other rich ocean of feeling is attributed to this other center, the heart. A lot rides here on the question of what we mean by will. When the medievals, as I read them, use the word voluntas and the cognate words, which is often translated will, it seems to me that they're picking out something very different than what we in our contemporary vernacular languages are picking out by the word will. The notion of voluntas, for at least most of the medieval scholastics, is fundamentally this adherence to the good, this fundamental assent, this yes to the good, just as the intellect is a fundamental adherence to being, a fundamental grasp on being. So we have sort of these two fundamental directednesses of the person. The world comes into me, so to speak, that's intellect, and I respond to the world, that's voluntas, which we translate often as will. So what's going on here? The medievals seem to be picking out two fundamental directionalities of the person, two fundamental orientations of the person towards the world as a whole. I take it they're doing something different. They're engaged perhaps in a different sort of project with significant overlaps, but a different sort of project to the one that Hildebrand or Seifert or myself or lots of other contemporary philosophers are engaged in. The sort of principles we have for carving up the person, for carving up our interior life, seem to me rather different when we compare these two worlds of thought. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Second thing that I think is important to keep in mind is the question of the meaning of words like states of affairs, realized, realizable by me, unrealized, and so forth. Hildebrand, when he talks about how the will can only respond to states of affairs that are as yet unrealized, but are in my power to realize, are realizable by me. Hildebrand seems to have in mind, at least in most of the examples he gives, states of affairs out there in the world. And if that's what we mean by states of affairs, situations that I can bring about, propositionally describable situations that I can bring about. And if the will is primarily oriented towards them, then it seems to me Seifert's criticism is right on. Absolutely right. Surely the will can do a lot more. That is, will both in the medieval sense of an adherence to the good and will in the modern sense of a conscious directly brought about by me stance towards the world, surely the will in either sense can intend things other than unrealized states of affairs. And Josef gave lots and lots of examples of that, right? I can will to affirm or consent to persons, God. I can will to have hope and love and all the sorts of things that he talked about there. But suppose we expand our notion of states of affairs. Suppose we expand our account of the propositionally describable situations to which we can direct ourselves, such that it includes internal states of affairs, internal propositionally describable situations. In that case, it seems to me that the will always does direct itself to a state of affairs, at least in a certain sense. That is, I don't directly will a person. I don't will my wife. I will that I love my wife, or I will that I affirm my wife's existence, or I will that I consent to her existence. I will that I hope she will attain salvation, and so forth. But in each case, the will seems to always have something to do with a state of affairs. And I wonder if this might be a way in which we can save Hildebrand's notion of the will always being directed towards a state of affairs. Admittedly, it involves revising what he seems to mean by state of affairs in those situations. But it might be a way to capture what I take to be the core of what he's up to. That the will, unlike the affections, doesn't respond directly to things out in the world. Rather, the will always responds to things out in the world by willing to take up a certain stance towards them, whether that be one of hope, sanctioning, affirming, repudiation, whatever it might be. So in each of these ways, I just think we need to sort out precisely what we mean by different sorts of terms, recognize when different conceptual systems are perhaps carving up our interior experiential space in different ways and for different reasons, and then see if there might be ways to harmonize these systems once we've gotten clear on what they're picking out with their particular technical terms. I'll stop there, so we have 20 minutes or so for question and answer.
May I give some short response to having been refuted by Mark?
Oh. I agree with almost everything you said.
Almost. Go ahead, Joseph.
Well, in the first place, I think that maybe I was guilty of that as well. And you too, we spoke, and you particularly spoke almost as if by definition the will is directed to the good. But the will is equally present in the will to do evil, in Satan. And the devil is not possible without free will. And the diabolical evils in this world under our eyes are not possible without the will taking a direction away from the good. And that also leads to the cooperative freedom. Our effective responses are not all gifts. Some of them are really bad, and some of them are vicious. And therefore, the will has also this, the cooperative freedom is perhaps a misnomer, because it is not only cooperating, but also disavowing and distancing the free center from these bad feelings. And so that's one point. The other is, you speak as if we carve out the different fundamental centers or powers of the person. So as if it was a matter of so to speak, we being sculptors who have a kind of undistinguished piece of wood in front of us, and now we carve out and we make 3 or 4 or whatever many centers. But I think this doesn't correspond to the knowledge of these centers, because, for example, in the distinction between intellect and will, however closely they are connected in many ways, but still the difference, I do not know a truth by my will, but by my intellect. And therefore the intellect is given as a fundamentally different center or faculty of the mind, distinct from the will. We don't carve it or make it up out of an indistinct unity, but we recognize that there are quite a multitude of acts that proceed from the intellect and others from the will, and the two are different, even though, as I said, they are closely interconnected, like also the heart and the will is closely interconnected. And from that point of view, I think that Father Brett remarked that because Hildebrand's notion of free will is too narrow, because he restricts it to the sphere of action and so on, and I agree with him on that, that is the purpose of my paper. But then he concludes from that therefore the affective life is, so to speak, part of the will, of the voluntas. And I think that it is different, and we must, so to speak, respect the difference which we didn't carve out of a unified piece of stone or wood, but which shows itself to be a different power, different faculty, or different center, however we want to name it. And of course, that's a very deep philosophical question that I will not enter here. What is meant by powers or by the fundamental centers? What is a center and so on? But that would be again going overboard, and we want to answer the questions of the audience, and I already incurred the kind of mild, smiling wrath of Christopher.
I am smiling with delight as I read the questions that have been submitted. So I'm promoting a couple of people, or a few people now. We'll try to get to their their questions. Let me ask one first, though. That's coming through our Q&A. This is for you, Joseph. But Mark, of course, you're welcome to reply as well. Ask if you can comment on the willingness about which we hear in the Eucharistic prayer that says, "At the time he was betrayed and entered willingly into his passion." How do our discussions here on the will help us to understand the willingness of Christ there?
Yeah, well, I think this is the willingness, I think, is here not that he himself, so to speak, actively imposed, like in the act of suicide or kind of self-mutilation, sufferings on himself. That doesn't mean willingness. But willingness is, I think, that he freely accepted this will of his Father, or the will of God, to redeem us through his passion and death. And that had to be freely accepted, like Mary, who accepted the message of the incarnation willingly. And so I think even more so, if the Son of God, and God in his nature is, so to speak, incapable of suffering, although I am not so quite sure of this, but certainly in a certain way, yes, and in another way, I think per eminentiam, so to speak, everything good in human suffering and everything adequate in human suffering is also somehow in God. I see the marvelous painting of El Greco, the kind of divine Dolorosa, where the God the Father holds the dead body of Christ in his lap, like normally is depicted with Mary. And the expression of his face is also a deep passion, a deep sorrow to see it. So I think in some way, whatever is good in the suffering is, I think, also somehow per eminentiam contained in the divine love. But that's another question. At any rate, I think Jesus Christ is God and man. And so, of course, his kind of God-man will, or the will of him as man and as God at the same time, was to freely accept that in his humanity, he would undergo this passion. And therefore, he willingly accepted it. It was not like the father forced him to suffer, or anybody forced him from the outside to suffer, but he accepted this passion willingly.
Okay, thank you. I hope that is helpful. Mark, did you have anything to add on that before we move to another question?
Nope.
Okay. Nicolo, you up? All right. Unmute yourself, please, or I can do it for you somehow. There we go.
Thanks a lot to both Professor Seifert and Professor Spencer for the very interesting reflections. I have to say that I'm really interested in this topic. I devoted to it the second part of my dissertation, and I read with great interest in Seifert's contributions in his article on human heart and the will, and as well as in his dissertation on human action. I have to say that even though I think that there are many interesting contributions there, I still find it very difficult, so to say, from a Thomist perspective, to accept the very distinction between heart and will. And this is also has to say with something that Father Brent has said yesterday. I try to summarize, to say, main arguments in a Thomistic standpoint to refuse this distinction. So one of them is, in a way, has been referred to by Professor Spencer as well. Both volitions and affections do relate to their objects, to the, so to say, material objects, under the formal perspective of goodness and badness, so to say. But then there's another argument as a sort of Brentanian argument, but can be fully shared by Thomists, and this idea that, so to say, Professor Seifert before told us that affections and volitions have a clearly distinct mode of intentionality. So let's say when I experience joy, this is a clearly different experience from the experience of wanting something, of intending and choosing something. But then the problem comes with something like hope or desire, because there are many acts like hope, desire, that has both volitional and affective features. And so this is the reason why Brentano, for example, used this, according to my opinion, very powerful argument of the gradual continuum between feeling and will in order to refuse a too sharp distinction among the two realms. Because if we accept that some acts, some psychic acts, share both volitional and affective features, then are we supposed to find a third center that is neither the will nor the heart in order for them to come into being? Or do we have to say that they are both acts of the will and the heart, but then ultimately we should find a center or faculty that is more concerned with them? So I really think that Thomistic idea of the will as a unique faculty of higher spiritual volitions higher spiritual affections and volition as well, is not a reductionist conception of affectivity. It's just a really way of enlarging. So both all the tradition or the pre-modern tradition has this idea, not because they wanted to construct, to reduce affectivity to the realm of the will, but really they had a much broader conception of the will, having to do with this idea of formal object, of the good as formal object, and of the gradual continuum, to say it in Brentanian terms. So I would like to know what Professor Seifert can, if you can criticize this argument of the gradual continuum between feeling and will.
How can I overcome this new criticism which, after Mark, you presented? That's very deep and difficult question, because I think your remarks are very, very keen and very, very intelligent, and the answer is very difficult. But I think the first answer I would give is that distinction is in order to unite, not to separate. To distinguish two things doesn't mean that they are separated. On the contrary, for example, to distinguish man and woman doesn't mean that they cannot get united in marriage. Or to distinguish two individual persons doesn't mean that sort of reduces the possibility of union. On the contrary, this type of marital union presupposes the distinction of two different persons, and therefore, and even of two different sexes. And therefore, I think this applies also here. And my position was precisely against Hildebrand somehow that love is originally also not only by sanctioning affections, but originally also both a response of the will and a response of the heart. And in the ideal case, they both go hand in hand, and more than that, the will, so to speak, sanctions the affective response, and the two become quite united. And the same is true in hope and in the other acts that you mentioned. And I think this does not mean that the same act somehow activates two different centers, like also the same value response also activates the intellect that perceives the value and the response. That doesn't mean that the distinction has to be abolished. I think rather the richness of understanding this union is precisely to understand the union of two distinct things, of two distinct movements of the heart and of the will, but that doesn't, so to speak, deny their distinction.
Thanks.
I could add a little. I suppose my approach to this question is to say, why not have both distinctions? That is, we can, and let me clarify, when I talk about carving, I don't mean it in a constructivist sense. I mean it in an abstractive sense. That is, we consider given experience and we draw out of it its essential structure. I wonder, Niccolo, if there might be something that's sort of captured on both approaches, and what we just need is a more sort of fine-grained map of our interior powers. That is, we have these two fundamental directionalities, one being coming in, one me responding to the world, and you can call those what you like, I guess. We could call the one intellect and the other one will. We can call them something else. Being directedness and good directedness, value directedness, whatever it might be. Always remembering that yes, that includes bad and evil and disvalue and so forth as well. But then we can then also say, well, we can carve them up according to formal objects as well. That is, we can distinguish, sometimes I relate to things under the formal object of, I don't know, truth, and sometimes I relate under the formal object of good as consciously being able to be directed to by me, and then sometimes insofar as they are valuable or disvaluable, and we can call those intellect, will, and heart. And then there's the trick of, the work of how to relate those two accounts, those two essential structures to one another. But there I think you're going to get the uniting side, right? So in the threefold distinction, you have the distinction side, and then in the twofold distinction, you have, here are all the ways that they get then tied together. So it might be that just we need a more fine-grained metaphysics with more distinctions in it, and then relate them to one another.
Well, I'm risking to be repetitive, but I think, for example, take such an act as adoration. Some of you said before that is affective response. I don't think adoration is an effective response. I think it is a response of our free will to the holiness of God. But I do think that adoration, like the Sanctus, 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 Dominus Deus Sabaoth, includes a affective response to God. It should be both the affirmation of the will of the holiness of God, the praising Him with my will, but it should also include the affective response, the joy over heaven and earth are full of your glory and so on. So I think the higher we go, and the first commandment of Christ is giving in terms of all the faculties. You should love God with all your heart, with all your will, with all your power, with everything. And so I think this love of God and the love can also use the intellect and use the will and use the heart, but that doesn't. And of course, in God, they would all be one without being distinct powers. So your resistance to the carving out would here be completely overcome, because the same person would, know, would, will, would, love, and so and there are no like three distinct faculties and powers.
Okay.
We
What's
we
that?
might discuss it part about it. There's no time, I guess. There's no
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
to
I mean,
discuss it.
I hope we can find, and we will. We're working on it right now on a side chat, like how to get more time right now to continue some of these
Thanks a lot.
these discussions. But and I know we're already going a couple minutes over, but we're gonna go a couple more minutes over, just because I've got two people already on deck, and I want to at least allow them to get their questions, since you've been waiting patiently here. Tom, and then Peter. Yeah, okay. Well, Tom, go ahead, but let's try to focus your question on the topic of the will and the heart, because it's a very broad question, I know. So you may unmute yourself, please, and go ahead.
I'll try to hone it in there. Since Niccolo asked a very erudite and smart question, I'll ask a very elementary question. So for von Hildebrand, I guess this is more of a biographical question about his life. I mean, how well read was he in the Thomistic tradition, especially given his early education, but also later on in his life with regard to how Thomas understood the relationship between the intellect and the will, and the will and the passions, and then how he relates all of that to his understanding and conception of the heart. All of that is to say, did he have a sufficient reading and understanding of Thomas to be able to, I guess, is he in dialogue with Thomas on these issues, or is he kind of off on his own, not really speaking to the conceptions of the human person that Thomas has in mind?
Yeah, that's a sort of indiscreet question. And I never dared to ask Hildebrand how many works of Thomas he had actually read. But I would say that he certainly knew many texts of Thomas, and also quotes him quite a few times, and admired certain fundamental distinction of Thomas, like between the actus hominis and the actus humanus, the personal act of man and the mere act of man, like sneezing, that is not a personal act of man. So he, and the finis primarius ultimus and secundarius ultimus, and so several other fundamental distinctions of Thomas, Hildebrand knew and used and he incorporated in his own philosophical knowledge of the truth. But I do not, I mean, he certainly was not a scholar of the works of St. Thomas. He didn't recite pages and pages and questions and know exactly which. So I think certainly his whole education was in the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. He was a student of Husserl, then a friend and in some ways students of Scheler, and above all of Adolf Reinach, the genius philosopher who died very early at age 35. And so he admired them, and he in a certain way followed in their footsteps. And so he loved also many other. He loved particularly St. Augustine. He loved Anselm of Canterbury, even though when I defended the ontological argument of Anselm, he first contradicted me and does so in his What is Philosophy. But later, when I explained to him my argument, he called his wife and said, Lily, come, maybe Joseph has saved the argument. So anyway, he was very open to the medieval thinkers, and had a special love for Anselm and a special love for St. Augustine, and like in many things about St. Anselm he loved very much, and about Augustine even more. He read certainly many of the works of Augustine with great passion. But I never asked him, like, if he had been my student, how much did you actually read? I read more because I was much more widely attacked by the Thomists than Hildebrand. And in the University of Dallas, there was a Professor Wilhelmsen who me as the destroyer of truth and of an essentialist who believed that esse or being is only a hair in the soup of essences. And I had to resist this and wrote a long essay and had a big public debate with Hildebrand and wrote a whole book, Being and Essence, that very much, let's say, was dialogue with the existentialist Thomists and Gilson especially. And so I learned a lot through the encounter. And Hildebrand never had such a strong encounter of Thomists as I. Because the Thomists he knew at Fordham University were more civilized.
Mark, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah.
Is that a no?
That was a no. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I know we're going a little bit over. We have one more question I want to take from Peter here, who is patiently waiting.
Thanks, Christopher. I'll try to keep it pretty brief. So Mark, when you began, I really appreciated kind of your point that a lot of these debates may depend on exactly what we mean by words and sort of how we're using the word will or how we're using the word heart affections as we, your phrase, carve up the interior life of the person. And I'm kind of wondering as I listen to that and sort through some of the earlier presentations as well, whether either of the panelists think that anything in particular rides on that outcome. So I mean, there's a philosophical discussion, right? We want to understand the nature of the human person and the different powers we have and how we relate to the world. Does either of you have examples of how you think it might make a difference as to how we lead our lives if we adopted one model rather than the other? Or is the practical payoff going to be more or less the same if the intellect, the will, and the heart are working together in some proper fashion?
I mean, I can answer autobiographically that once I accepted Hildebrand's distinctions, I took my emotional life much more seriously than I previously had. And I guess I took certain spiritualities that I had previously taken seriously, less seriously after that. So Rocco Bertiglione talked about the Carmelite approach, denying all love of creatures, and so as to purely ascend to the love of God. And I mean, I think I was probably grossly misreading John of the Cross in my, when I was in high school and college when I read him for the first time. But this reading John of the Cross led me to not take my emotional life seriously and think that any emotions that I had in prayer were a bad thing and distraction and leading me astray and so forth. And reading Hildebrand made me, and specifically accepting the idea that at least some of my affections, these spiritual affections, were on par with my intellect and with my ability to choose and creatively direct myself. That sort of led to a lot of, interior healing, I guess, and a lot of improvements in my relationship with my wife and with my friends and with all sorts of things, and realizing, like my love of nature and the beauty of nature, which had sort of been peripheral to my intellectual life, began to be able to become central to my intellectual life. And my personal interests in the outdoors and things sort of got integrated into my intellectual life. So I think that it sort of gives you a framework within which you can take certain aspects of your life seriously that you might not otherwise. That's just purely anecdotal, though I have seen the exact same thing in my students, some of them. So.
Thanks.
And on the other hand, maybe this remark about the free will of Hildebrand, which he later himself corrected, that it's only related to states of affairs and so on, and that the heart can respond to persons, to God, and so on, that I think maybe influenced me for a time of my life before I made my critique of this point, in the sense that I attributed to the affective life and the affective aspects of love a role that in a certain way played down the role of the will, at least at the origin of love, and so to speak, in the substance of love. Of course, the cooperative freedom was fully present in Hildebrand, and also the indirect freedom and influence on our affections. But if you, in a certain way, make the will subservient to the heart by just sanctioning this voice of the heart, which alone is, for example, love or love of God, then I think you are in a certain way. For example, he interpreted the first two commandments as being that affection cannot be commanded, and therefore what is commanded is just that you cooperate and that you act, so to speak, upon this affective love of God. But I think a certain spiritual complete into, and therefore I think the correction Hildebrand himself made in the end of his work was an important step to avoid that danger, kind of what Karl Wojtyla calls the subjectivization of consciousness, or the emotionalization of consciousness. And I think so that is another side to but I fully agree with Mark, and I regard it as one of my greatest gifts that I had this contact with Hildebrand, and he disclosed to me so many truths.
We're getting lots of great feedback about the answers to this question here in the comments, and I hate to I hate to wrap this up at all, but we're a little bit over time now. So this is tomorrow. So I will say, though, as a example here of a value response, in this case, the response to the value of all of your good questions and comments, we being the Hildebrand Project staff are over in a little chat here in the corner trying to add some more sessions so that we can have some more time to talk and to follow up on some of these ideas. I'm not exactly sure the status of it, though, so we're gonna invite John Henry or Catherine to jump in here. I'm unmuting you both. Speak. So we're gonna have some, looks like a few different sessions, but we want to see what you want to talk about, and so we'll invite you to let us know, and we can add some more time just to talk. This is a little bit more. People have referenced a couple of times, sitting around the fountains, talking at our in-person seminars. So we can consider these additional ad fontes sessions. So,
well, Christopher, I am here. My camera is okay. Can you see me?
Great.
All righty. So I'm going to let Catherine actually run the poll here, which you all should be seeing now. So based on all of the questions we've been receiving and not been able to feature, we have these different categories, which we thought of as being the more theoretical and philosophical, and then the more applied. And we owe it to Peter Meilander for seeing this chat going on and suggesting 4 topics. And we just out of uncertainty regarding a sufficient number of people, we decided to run with 3. So I hope Peter, you still approve. But so the idea is that tomorrow afternoon, after the lecture with Bishop Barron and Rocco Buttaglione, starting at 3:30 p.m. Eastern time, we would have these sessions. Now, these would be concurrent sessions in an effort to create smaller groups and also not to intrude sort of into your schedules too far beyond the time that you've committed to the seminar. We know that life goes on when you're not physically with us here in Steubenville and you have to turn to other things. So we didn't want to just presume and schedule your afternoons and evenings for you. So if you all could just vote on these three options, just to give us a sense of what the breakdown would be like. And Catherine, if I'm not wrong, these are exclusive options, right? One picks, yes, you pick one of those issue areas. And you'll note in there that there's the one that is regards the personalism in the life of the church. We know that there are many of you here who are working in and on behalf of the church, whether in Catholic education as DREs, catechists, and so on. And we understand that there's a desire to make the philosophical and theological ideas, concepts that have been presented here as applicable for you in your work as possible. And we want to create a dedicated forum for that. But there are also many questions that we don't get to that you know, from those of you who are particularly interested in mapping the Hildebrand with Aquinas, the tradition broadly understood also with more contemporary thinkers. And so this would be an opportunity in that Hildebrand and the tradition session to look more closely at those frankly excellent philosophical and historical questions that many of you have raised. And then of course there's the personalism in education theme that that might come close to some of those of you who work in Catholic education. So maybe that's the breakdown there. If you want to talk specifically about questions of education, that would be your panel. If you're looking for more for broader application to questions of evangelization and so on, then please come to the other session. So I can't see the results yet. Do we, Christopher, do you know if we need to leave the session open until everyone has had a chance to vote?
Catherine.
Yeah, Catherine, tell us.
I think you could continue the whole night.
I can see the results coming in. The session does need to be open if someone would like to vote, but maybe.
But at least some people, like for example, Nicolo seems to want to continue the discussion. Some people who would like to continue the discussion, I could stay up. It's here only 10, 15. But is there still today a social event?
No.
No.
We had not scheduled one, but we can certainly, those of you who want to stay and speak more with Professor Seifert, who is so graciously...
We could leave the site open, and those who would like to speak.
Yeah, since you all are here, you're welcome to do that, but we didn't want to assume we couldn't.
If you have dropped out of the program, then I will leave.
I could, if you'd like to be promoted to a panelist in order to stay with Dr. Seifert, please raise your hand and I'll switch you over.
There you go.
Mm-hmm. Lots of hands. This is great. You all are very eager. So yeah, so we've got the results coming in.
I must thank one person who just sent a chat message. And for the first time in my life, and I thought yesterday when I don't know which person said the same thing to my daughter, Maria Walter, Maria, you are a rock star. Now somebody said, Dr. Seifert, you're a rock star. And I take it as the highest compliment, although I personally don't like rock music at all. And I'm sure that that being called a rock star means something very nice. And so I thank you very much for so to speak, the nicest remark after any of my lectures I ever heard.
Well, Joseph, as this evening's rock star, you can stay on and speak with those who are staying, and we have a good number of people who will join you. So, but for those of you who cannot stay, obviously this is the end of the session, but you're more than welcome to stay. And in any case, we continue tomorrow morning, again, starting at 10 in the morning. And I would just, again, highlight that we have tomorrow afternoon the very, but we have a sort of slight divergence from our normal program in that we have the presentation with Bishop Robert Barron and Rocco Bucciolione discussing the centenary of the birth of John Paul II, an exploration of his legacy, and really a look at those critics of John Paul II, who even including people within the church who at one point might have been admirers of John Paul, who increasingly speak of a kind of failure of the project of JP2, of the legacy of JP2. So I think there will be quite a vigorous defense of the legacy and the witness of John Paul II tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And I certainly invite all of you to come to that. That will be, Catherine, if I'm not wrong, that will be a webinar as in the morning style, right? And we'll have a much larger audience then. In any case, I think that is correct. But I invite all of you to be with us for that tomorrow. And if you want to invite friends to join, they're welcome to do that. They can sign up on our website, or they can, of course, see it also on the Facebook Live stream. But we look forward to a very large public for that. But with that, I turn it over to this evening's rock star, Josef Seifert. Take it away.
Mark, not here. Anyway, I know I don't want to speak. I want to listen to what your questions are, what you want to discuss.
Christopher, any guidance for Joseph? Does he need to?
Well, I mean, we can call on people. We still had a couple of, or actually a number of questions in the Q&A. Actually, Joseph, you're able to read those if you wanted to respond to any in particular. If you click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, at the bottom of your video screen, it should bring up those questions. You know, so you could reply to any of those if you want, or we could call on people. I don't know. Well, let's see. Is Maria Federica still here? Oh wait, did Mark have to leave? Or is Mark Spencer?
Mark has left.
Oh, okay. Maria had a good question for Mark. We'll have to ask that later. Mario had an interesting question. I see Roy Hine here. I think he had a very good question. Sort of a statement. I agree with your statement, Roy. I think that's an accurate assessment. I can't really hear you, Joseph.
He plugged in his headphones.
Microphone.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. So now you hear me. Well, I don't know. I could read, of course, like Niccolo Lorenzetto asked a question, but I think it was more or less the same question that he asked.
Yeah, here. I'll dismiss the ones that we that we got to ask. Those have been answered already. And then we've got a number of other ones.
Yeah,
I guess we asked Peter's also.
Yeah, you, Christopher, you are the kind of master of ceremony, and therefore
well,
you can pick out the questions that would.
All right. Well, in that capacity, let me call on Mario. I thought that was a good question. I've actually answered it in the in the chat already, but if you want to just go ahead and ask it, I'd be curious. And feel free. I think you know, we'll let Joseph give him the privilege to respond first, but anyone else who wants to respond or join in on the conversation, please do so.
Thank you, Christopher. Well, first of all, leading up to my question, I just wanted to observe that it seems that a lot of von Hildebrand's arguments, and this is a virtue of those arguments, faithfully appeal to experience. That's where their strength lies. In describing what we first and foremost have to simply see for ourselves. His arguments rehabilitating the heart are appeals to the heart, to our experience of feelings. And I like what you said about the fact that it resonates with experience that a complete person is not without heart. And so if God is the most complete person, then it follows that we have to attribute feelings to God. But once we do that, aren't we left with hardly any recognizable notion of feeling? I mean, where do we stop too? Obviously, we can't square with experience the idea of an unfeeling God. But yet, what kinds of feelings must we attribute to him? And we also can't square with experience, I would argue, the idea of a God who doesn't sorrow, who isn't saddened for a fallen sinner, then what becomes of the metaphysical axiom of the impassibility of God? Must we choose between metaphysics and what resonates with experience?
Very difficult question.
We can't hear you, Joseph.
When I speak, I need to take away the, although I bought this microphone plus earphones, especially not to have to do that. But anyway, yeah, I think it's a very deep and a very difficult question. And this impassibility of God, I mean, if the metaphysics, but the metaphysics, I think, speaks of the impassibility of God because it considers passion or suffering as an evil. And therefore it cannot be in God, or as a lack of something, and therefore it cannot be in God. And I think in as much as suffering is, so to speak, diminishing the divine blessedness and is an evil and is something bad happening to God, I do think that this has a deep sense, this impassibility of God. But I think if the passion is a perfection, or inasmuch as sadness is something good, like, for example, in fact, Christ's Sermon on the Mount says, "Blessed are those who are sad and who are crying now," and so on. They will be consoled. And if we consider also the many messages of Mary, how sad God is and how sad she is and how her heart is wounded and so on, it's of course very difficult to understand how can that be compatible with them being in eternal bliss. But my personal response would be that everything about sadness as a due response to evil that is good in this sadness is also in God preeminently. And only what is bad, what is an imperfection, what is a diminishing of his blessedness, that cannot be assumed in God. Of course,
it seems to me also another example in the divine is holy, what we would call holy wrath. I mean, clearly Christ in his person, in his human person had it. But it seems to me that the impassibility also, besides the diminishment, refers to, quotes, a change, the irrational, erratic response of God to different things. I think although one could get that impression times in reading the Old Testament, I think to say that God doesn't have wrath or anger, justified anger towards evil when he sees it. And of course, in God, he's not reacting event by event. He's got this eternal position, it seems to me, of love towards things that are good and antipathy toward things that are bad, to use just two dichotomous things. And I think that certainly is possible in God and is a mirror for what we can achieve on earth, to the extent that what we do somehow imperfectly mirrors the divine essence.
Yeah, I think it confirms what I tried to say, and this is completely, it's another very good point. And so I think, and the example of wrath is also, I mean, the Old Testament is full of the wrath of God, and also the sadness of God. Even is attributed, repented that he has created man, because the man sinned so terribly much, and he was about to destroy us all. And then Noah and his family sort of saved all of humanity by being the only just people God could find on earth. That's an incredible statement. I mean, it must have been the old times must not have been so much better than our times, because I think today you would find at least 10 or 20 or 100 adjustment. So therefore, I think, yeah, and I think, but I think we must not, so to speak, anthropomorphically imagine God as, so to speak, running around in earth and once he's mild and then he's full of anger. But I think somehow his eternal perfection has preeminentiam all these responses that are due to evil or to good. And in a certain way, that is a mysterious kind of entering, like the incarnation, a kind of entering something eternally in God into time in Christ. But we must also assume that in God himself, there are whatever is true and proper value response or response to evil is contained in him. So I think we must maybe not have a false view of this impassibility of God, or of this, yeah. It's of course quite mysterious. How can coincidentia oppositorum, this notion of Nicolaus of Kues, which Hildebrand liked very much in his chapter 11 of his Ethics, he has this discussion of the different kinds of opposites that coincide in God, but Hildebrand means only the complementary, the friendly opposites, whereas some interpreters of Kues interpret God is both good and evil, like Luther said that the evil begins in God and there's the devil in God and so on. And I think these are these are opposites which absolutely cannot be in God. But I think the ones who, so to speak, how the eternal bliss and tranquility of God and the anger over the sin and the how that can somehow coexist in super eminence, and not in the human way, but in a divine way. I think we must assume that. Otherwise, God would be, so to speak, his impassibility would be a kind of impersonal, yeah, kind of impersonal being. Therefore, I think we must. Otherwise, also Christ would not be a revelation of God. How would that Christ love and passion be an auto-revelation of God? If God had, if there were nothing in God that would correspond to this kind of tender love and readiness to give his life. So, any other question?
Mario, is that a satisfactory answer? I thought it was. I was just going to say get rid of the whole metaphysics, but Joseph gave a much better.
No,
answer.
I really appreciate it. I wanted to hear how you would respond, mainly. At the same time, I could imagine a strict Thomist pressing the issue and finding in sadness, in spite of its status as being good for us, a note of privation, and for that very reason, wanting to purge it from the pure act, divine essence. But at the same time, I mean, from Hildebrand's perspective, to deprive God of those privations, if you will, or those feelings of sadness and sorrow, would be to deprive him of the due relation to things, because you would say that it's objectively sorrowful. And so we would have something over him. I don't know how, but I don't think a Thomist would be satisfied with your answer, but I'm not a Thomist of strict observance. And I thank you very much.
Everything, therefore I said everything which is good and perfect, and if we cannot deprive God of giving the proper response to evil, and yeah, so I think preeminentiam, in a mysterious way that we cannot combine. We can also not quite understand how the blessed in heaven can be sad over, can look at the sins of their children and be happy and blessed in heaven. But in some way that must be possible, and that is quite mysterious, no doubt. And in the Old Testament, there's this marvelous passage which I cite in my novel. It's not translated into English, but it's called God's Third Temptation, or the Gospel of the Devil. And in that novel, I quote this passage from the prophet Jeremiah, in which God asks the prophet to mourn and to weep over the fall of Satan. And he says that this was a perfect angel. He was in paradise, all good. He was perfect and wise and beautiful, and everybody looked up to him. And this great angel fell to his own pride. And I ask you to weep and to mourn the loss of this great angel. So that somehow shows that God even continues to love the devil as he created him and as he wanted him, but that he somehow gives the due response even to the devil's fall. So why would he not be saddened by the many evils? So I think everything that is good in holy sadness or in mourning evils is in God somehow more perfectly and more purely, but in a different way than in men. That's what I would say.
Could we return to the earlier discussion about your encounter with somewhat hostile Thomists on the question of being and essence as part of a background for personalism that Dietrich von Hildebrand didn't really share with you? What was the source of that hostility at that point in the history of your encounter with the Thomists back in, what was it, the 1940s, where that battle was acute?
No, 1940s, I did not live yet. Well, 45 I was born, but in the early part of the 20th century, there was, of course, big discussion between Thomists and others in France. But no, this debate, I think, first of all, it was a particularly peculiar group of Thomists. And of this particularly peculiar group of Thomists, Fritz Wilhelmsen was the most peculiar case. And so I think he was like extremely fond of the idea that God is only existence and no essence in God, and therefore any kind of attributing to essential properties was kind of against God, and the ising and the being, and that's just the thing, and everything else in essence is just a limitation of the pure act of being, and so. And so I think it is. I try to show that this is a very deep error, and because I think the perfections of essence, like being person, that's an essential perfection, not just ising or being, or the perfections of justice, of mercy. These are perfections that are not simply existing. And in fact, the whole value of existing of esse depends also on what exists. I mean, being is not the perfection if the concentration camp of Auschwitz exists. So the being depends in its value on what exists. And I think there's no being either finite or infinite that is only existing and not also has a nature, has an essence. Therefore, I think to separate this and to sort of consider all content of perfections a limitation is, I think, ending in some kind of, atheism.
Was this under the influence of existentialism, say in the spirit of Sartre, where essence was seen to be as a limitation on human freedom, and the emphasis on existence was a kind of rebellion against any essentialism? I mean, was that the cultural background to this debate?
I think it's it's another, of course, another point, but in some ways ends up in a kind of Sartrean position. And I think that there are these, what I call the pure perfections, like knowing, like the truth, like justice, like love, and so on. And these are perfections of the nature, of the content, of the essence of something, and these are admit of infinity, and the idea that only ising can be infinite, and whenever you attribute any property, any perfection, any to God, then you distort his reality and his transcendence. That I think is a great mistake. It presents as if any kind of essential perfection would be could not be infinite. It would only be finite. And I think that's a big error, a huge error, in my opinion, because it leads to kind of agnosticism. We cannot say anything content about God. We cannot say that he's loving or merciful or infinite or that he's good. To say all these things would somehow be attributing to him an essence which we must not do. Therefore, I think it leads to a kind of agnosticism about God, because what can we say about a being that only is and doesn't have any essential property? And I think it's a misunderstanding of this of St. Thomas' statement that God is esse tantum. They of course make a lot of this statement that God is only being, but they interpret it as being esse alone. And I think it means that he's perfect esse, but only esse, no lack of being. That is, so to speak, infinitely being without any defect in his being. But I don't think that implies that he has absolutely no essence, which I think would be impossible in itself and would also be completely destroy the perfection of God. Maybe how could we adore only being without any content, without any holiness, without any I think therefore the union of essence and existence must be perfect in God. But in God, esse is part of his essence. That's the Anselmian hope for the existence of God. In God, the being doesn't fall outside his essence. But that doesn't mean that his essence is totally reduced to existing and there's no content of no whatness of God. I think that's a completely wrong metaphysics, in my opinion. Yeah, Mario wants to.
The position of Gilson and the existential Thomists that follow him, as I understood it, was that because of the purity of existence in God, all essential perfections flow from him. So we're supposed to somehow think of existence in its purity as a fountainhead of all essential perfections, even though we can't conceptualize existence. For them, there's no concept of existence. And so it strictly contradicts what St. Thomas says in chapter 5 of the Diente, the idea that there are no essential perfections in God because he's pure existence, because that's where he says very clearly that we should not say this. We should not say that there are no essential perfections. Pure existence is as if there were some quality which could produce all the other qualities. For instance, fire, which could produce every other conceivable quality. That's what pure existence is. But it's nonetheless, I find, very difficult to understand, because the source of all essential intelligible structures is something itself which is not, strictly speaking, intelligible. It's not conceptualizable.
Yeah, I think that's, in my opinion, well, first of all, this interpretation is different from Gilson, because Gilson in Being and some philosophers says where esse is alone without existence, that's God. But I think that's, so your statement, your interpretation is more that the pure esse of God, so from it proceed all essential perfections. so to speak, is the source of all essential perfections. But I think even that I cannot quite agree, because in the Anselmian argument somehow the divine essay is part of the divine essence, is, so to speak, God exists necessarily because he is that greater than which nothing can be conceived. So to speak, his infinite perfection includes his, I think the two coincide completely in God, but and are necessarily united, and not like in us where existence comes, so to speak, from the outside to us as a gift. That is of course not possible in God, but I think he contains equally originally the infinite perfection of essence and of existence, in my opinion. And the absolute
Niccolo?
of essence, that was the main reason to attack me widely in Dallas. The absolute priority of existence or essence is, I think, a phrase that needs to be examined, and I try to examine in which way the essay has priority over essence and in which way not. And I think one needs to do justice fully to essay, to this existing, and to essence.
Well, this is
why I was
very
drawing
fruitful discussion.
The application to Sartrean existentialism, because I was seeing something of a spin-off at that time in the 1930s and into the 1940s, where freedom was understood as complete self-determination without any essential standard of good and evil, right and wrong, just and unjust, that somehow you determined your own existence by whatever choices you made. Now, that's a crude reading of existentialism, but I think the real danger in that absolute emphasis on man's freedom, on human freedom, leads to that.
Even if you're true to God, I think you completely falsify his freedom, because God would be the totally arbitrary, whatever he arbitrarily decided would be good, and whatever he disapproved of would be bad, without it being, as the Dietrich says, that God, the gods or God, wants the good because it is good. It's not good because God wants it.
That's it, because then freedom would be indistinguishable from randomness. It would be simply arbitrary. Yeah. There would be no standard of goodness. And, exactly. And freedom and random wandering would be equivalent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We agree.
Call on Niccolo has been patiently digitally raising his hand here with the little digital raise button, which all of you please feel free to do. It's actually a great way for us to see who kind of has something they want to say. So Niccolo, go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe commenting on these points, I don't know Wittgenstein at all, but I'm sure that many, the greatest, so to say, existential Thomists, they absolutely wouldn't agree with his interpretation of ipsum esse subsistence. So I think that Professor Seifert were absolutely right in criticizing that, and also regarding this idea of, so to say, the Sartrean conception of freedom. As Maritain is very clear in his, so to say, existential book on Short Treatise on Excellent Existence, for example, the very idea that man's existence is, so to say, anterior to his essence, that doesn't make any sense in Thomist perspective. So maybe, so to say, when we speak of existential Thomism, there might have been in the language a kind of way of similarity to atheistic existentialism of that, so to say, in anthropology, in ethics, and in metaphysics, that the great existential Thomists were different. I just wanted to go briefly back to the very mysterious and important questions that we were touching upon before on affectivity in God. So going back to what Father Brand said yesterday, I think that the main problem here is really the problem that also the Luque told us before. This is not just a problem of moral goodness and offness, because the very act of desire is a problem to attribute desire to God. Even if, so to say, it would be, even if it were a good desire, it's not just anger, it's not just sadness in Thomist perspective. The problem is desire itself, because desiring means by its very essence, by the very essence of desire, that I lack something. And even if I, so to say, I put it in the largest way, so I say, okay, it is in an analogous way, per eminentiam, but if I attribute that per eminentiam to God, I attribute it properly, I'm saying that it lacks something while desiring. So whereas joy, for Father Brent told us yesterday, whereas joy and love, by their very essence, don't imply any sort of lack, any sort of privation, desire, sadness, and all these things do imply privation. I'm not saying that I mean, there are Thomists like Maritain himself, he spoke of sadness in God as a way of unnamed perfection. So to say, perfection with no name. Many Thomists criticize him, but I think that is really a mysterious point. So I wouldn't say, oh, it's clear that since it implies, so to say, a limitation and perfection, we have to say, no, it's just metaphorically attributed to God. I see the problem of what is God's reaction to concentration camp. I would just say that metaphysically it's very difficult, even if we strive towards saying, oh, there is sadness in God toward evil. Metaphysically it's very difficult to affirm it properly, to affirm it even per eminentiam. That's the matter, that's the problem, I would say. And so I'm not saying I oppose it, but the real problem is just, as Mario De Lucchi said before, the very idea of limitation implied by the very essence of certain affections. Desire as well as sadness, and as well as anger. And so that's the key, I guess.
I think that we must not attribute to God any of the imperfections in which desires, lacks, evils, sadness, sufferings exist in the human nature. But I think everything that is good, that is true, I think that it must exist in God in a supereminent way. And I would say not metaphorically, because metaphorically sounds as if it would not really, it would be just a metaphor. But I think rather well, it can be metaphorically in the sense where there's a mixed perfection, an essentially imperfect thing that is attributed to God only analogously and metaphorically, that is not itself is attributed. But I think when we come to these pure perfections like knowledge or like the proper response to good and to evil, then I think God is the primum analogatum in the language of Cajetan. And it is, so to speak, much more perfectly, he gives the pure response to all goods and evils than man. And so to speak, take away what is imperfect in the human response to the affections. But what is perfect in them is in God even much more fully. Speak.
No, I get the point. It's just that maybe what is imperfect in our way of experiencing joy and experiencing love is absolutely not present in the perfect way of God's love and joy. But the problem is desire by its very essence of desire implies a lack of the thing desired. So we cannot, so to say, put desire in an infinite way without, so to say, desire to remain desire in a proper way implies the absence of what is desired. And so we are attributing it to God in a way that our problem, I'm not saying that's impossible, but the metaphysical problem is, how are we supposed to understand that this desire is in God if someone who desires something lacks the thing that he desires? That's the point. Just that. I'm not saying that I oppose that, but that's the point.
It doesn't seem necessary, though, to focus on desire. I was thinking more so of sadness.
Yeah. I would just making the point.
Sorrow. Yeah. Because desire, it seems like it's. I don't see why someone would want to press if there's desire in God.
Eminentiam, if it says in the Holy Scripture, "Hac est voluntas Dei sanctificatio vestre," that is the will of God, your holiness, your sanctification. And in a certain way, God expresses that he desires that we become holy. So in that sense, it's part of the divine perfection to desire it, but not in the sense that he's lacking something if he don't become good, that there is, so to speak, so everything, I think, that is in these things, like desire, like hope, like joy, like also sadness, perfect and good is in God. It is not, because it is not an imperfection, it's rather a perfection. I think.
I don't know if I make any sense, but I know Dr. Federica talks about like two forms of need. Like we can have a lack, we can need something in one sense that's like a deficiency, but then there's also like we see something we love and we need it because it's so beautiful. It's an overflow as opposed to a lack. I think that's a difference I notice a lot between like von Hildebrand and Aquinas. Like there's not, like our love is not rooted in an appetite or a lack or a deficiency or necessarily a desire in a negative sense, but I think it's more like we just, yeah, it's an overflow. It's not rooted in a lack, even human love. Like it's something where we see and we're just so taken by the beauty that we transcend ourselves. I don't know. I just don't see desire so much in the negative sense as like a lack. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes.
But in case it does, I just wanted to throw that out there.
There has to be desire if there's going to be difference. So even if it's like in a Trinitarian sense that the Father desires the Son and the Son desires the Father, and that desire sort of stands as the space between the two of them, and that they're distinct despite being one. So it's a perfection of desire between the two of them, you could say. But it's not desire in the sense that the Father lacks the Son or that they are still one, but that there is a space and a distance between them, and that the Father is not the Son.
Yeah, I think your Trinitarian theology is very, very beautiful, but you never must forget the word of the angel that played like in the form of a child at the beach when St. Augustine wrote De Trinitate. And then St. Augustine said, what are you doing? Pouring water out, or taking water out of the ocean and putting it in that little hole that cannot fit. And then this angel in the form of the child said to him, it's much easier that I can pour the whole ocean into this little hole than that the divine nature can be captured by your mind. And so this is a painting in Gamming in the Franciscan University campus in Austria. There is the St. Augustine with the child. And I think it's a very beautiful story because we somehow, we'd all attempt to clarity and to avoid the errors about God. We must always remain aware of the tremendous mystery that, so to speak, exceeds all our comprehension. But nevertheless, we must. What says he who speaks of you, God, says Augustine, and yet woe to you who are silent. So that kind of tension we must always keep in mind. And there is Pavel, a certain man, Pavel, beautiful beard, probably Polish you must be. You must put your microphone on if you want to speak. Yeah.
Hello everyone. My son is sleeping here in this room, so I hope I will not wake him up. Can you hear me properly?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. So actually, I met you, Professor, in Gamming during the conference by the Hildebrand Project. Maybe
Yeah.
you remember. Yeah. So yeah, it's true. I'm Polish, but I didn't really follow why you called me now.
Because you look so inquisitive and wise.
I can't hear you.
You cannot hear me?
I can't hear you.
Can you not hear me? I can hear you.
Can you hear, Professor?
Can the rest of you hear me?
I can hear you. I'm here in California.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Now we can.
I heard I had my speakers turned off. I'm really sorry. I didn't hear the last part.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry too. But anyway, did you have any questions or observation? Or I just, you looked so to speak, as if you were to contribute something. But if you want to remain silent, that is what said. If somebody remains silent, he remains a philosopher. Maybe that's what.
Well, I have a question if nobody else does.
Yeah.
Yeah, Professor Seifert, you said, I believe that you were talking with von Hildebrand about the ontological argument. And after you were finished, he said you had saved it. I would love to know what you said to him about the ontological argument. This might seem a little off topic, but it does have a lot to do with being. So, and I'll just say I understand by the ontological argument something like God is that greater than which nothing can be conceived or thought, therefore God exists, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So very well. I have written a 700-page German book on this defense of this argument.
Oh,
cool. I have written also several English texts on it. And if you send me through John Henry or through Peter has this book in his hand. God as proof of himself is the name of the title of the book.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, so it's difficult to say that in a few words.
Right.
But I think that this argument that you render there, say God is, what is God? What do we mean by God? God is that greater than, or something greater than which nothing can be conceived, which is similar to Plato and Augustine, who have defined God as that greater than which nothing can be. But then Anselm goes even beyond that, by saying it's not only that greater than which nothing can be, but even greater than which nothing can be conceived. And so, he says in chapter 2 of the Proslogion that God can only be that greater than which nothing can be, if he can be conceived, if he exists in reality. Because if he existed only in our mind, if it were just an idea that man makes himself, then he would not be that greater than which nothing can be conceived.